Okay. Oh yeah. Please make it so I can share. Put the book.
You should be good now.
Okay. All right. All right. So this isn't going to cover as much as I had wanted because I just didn't have time to get everything together, and the internet in my apartment has been very slow, so it's been difficult accessing a lot of stuff. Oh, I hope I don't get disconnected today. It's been pretty bad lately. All right, number six on our 10-person figure in Guam history journey. And so today we are going to, so last week we focused on Agata Johnston, who was born during the Spanish period, but lived until the post-war American period. And we mentioned a little bit about her war experience, but not a lot. And so I wanted to bring in Påle Jesus Baza Duenas to talk a little bit more about the CHamoru wartime experience. And so Jesus Baza Duenas is one of my favorite figures from Guam history. He is a name which is well known, but his story is retold in some ways, not retold in other ways. And so I've always found it very interesting as I've done Guam history research, oral history research in particular, finding more about sort of figures like Jesus Baza Duenas, who when you read a history book can appear one way, but then when you talk to people in the community can appear very differently. And so Påle Dueñas is one of those. And so as I'm talking to you today, a lot of this comes from reading as much as I could find, sort of in history books, but also in primary texts about Father Dueñas, and then also interviewing people and talking to people. There was a year or two where I spoke to just about anybody I could find who was alive in World War II and had connections to Father Dueñas, who had stories with Father Dueñas. And there was, when I was in graduate school, there was a small movement amongst the Father Dueñas graduation class from the 70s to try to get Father Dueñas to be canonized or beatified. And one of the most interesting things, as you'll find from this presentation, is the ways in which history and the church remembers Father Dueñas and how that then conflicts with our ability to remember him in certain ways and what he represents. That if he is a symbol of one thing, it may inhibit his ability to symbolize something else. All right. There's lots of things that I can talk about for Father Dueñas. But he was born after the Americans had taken over. He was born into a family. He was born to families which were higher on the higher class end, sort of the Chamorro social spectrum. The Dueñas family, the Baza family, and so when you go for those two families, for example, you have basically a whole bunch of people who became very politically and culturally powerful right after World War II. So, for example, amongst Father Dueñas's nephews, you had people, as we'll hear from later, Judge Cristobal Dueñas, who was a federal judge in Guam. You have people such as the Suilo brothers, Juan and Suilo Camacho, who were both priests. And you also had as one of his nephews, and then in that circle, you even had people such as Carlos Camacho, former governor. And so he came from sort of an elite background, which is one reason why he was able to leave Island for education. And so now the family history about Father Dueñas is one thing. And so, but of course, within the family and within the church, they always talk about how he he felt close to God. He sort of had a oh wait, are you recording already?
Again.
Okay, all right, just making sure. And so but when we find but what is always funny though is that there's always the usual things that you say about a religious figure, that they're super close to God, they love to pray and so on. But when I did a history research into Father Dueñas and his family, for example, one of the things that people did call him when he was young, so they called him chispas. So chispas is a word that refers to an ember or a spark. And so chispas is what you say for like a spark that like a coal that leaves the fire. It shoots out real fast from the fire. And so, although when I asked some of his family members, why did they call him that he moved, the way that he walked really fast. And he was always he walked with a quick step. He was in a hurry. And so people sort of teased him about that. That, as we will learn, the name comes to mean something very different a little bit later, during World War II. But so I believe that these are two pictures of him and his parents. I believe that that's his father on the left of him, and then his mother, who is on the right in the other picture. And so there were not a lot of educational opportunities for Chamorro. He went to public school, he went to private school in Guam, but for his age, once you reach, there was no high school on Guam, at least not at that point, no public high school. And so some Chamorros that had the means, their families sent them off island for school. Some were able to get college and high school off island with the support of the US Navy. But if you wanted to become a priest, and there were some Chamorros who did want to become priests at that time, you usually went to the Philippines for seminary. And so at just the age of 15 years old, Father Dueñas went to seminary in the Philippines. And he was joined there by at least two other Chamorro men, Oscar Lujan Calvo and Jose Ada Manabusan, who also went to seminary in the Philippines at that time. There were some others who did too, but those are the two that became priests with him. And so Jose Palomo, who we talked about earlier, was the first ever Chamorro priest, but he was ordained in the Philippines. When Påle Dueñas returned to the island in the late 1930s, he was the second ever Chamorro Catholic priest, and he was the first one to ever be ordained on Guam. And so here he is with Pale Scott, Oscar Lujan Calvo, who became the third Chamorro Catholic priest. And so when so when Father Dueñas came back to Guam, he joined an existing sort of circle of priests, a few of whom were Spanish, most importantly the Bishop Olano, but then the majority of the priests in his time were American. And so one thing that was very different about Påle Dueñas in the time that he became a priest versus the years before was that Chamorros were not used to having a Chamorro who was a priest. And so from some of the interviews that I did, people kind of they weren't necessarily ready to accept. They didn't necessarily say anything publicly, but that people weren't ready to accept having one of their own, and especially somebody who was so much younger, being a priest. And so he was moved to different parishes on the island in the first few years that he was on Guam. And some people told me that it was because, it's one thing if you're talking to an outsider, you're confessing to an outsider. It's one thing if it's somebody from Spain or the United States telling you sort of what is what in the church. It's different when it's somebody who you might be related to. And so things may have been a little bit difficult for him when he first came back to Guam. And by all accounts, he was a quiet person, a studious person, a smart person, but not very loud, not very outspoken, not super social. And so eventually he would be, at the time that World War II broke out, he would be placed into INALAHAN, and that would be his parish. Now, he had roots absolutely in the village of INALAHAN. He had close relatives from there. And so it is his connection to INALAHAN which would be a strong symbol, sort of as part of his legacy. So we do know that one song, which is sung in the Catholic Church today in Guam, San Jose PATRON-MÅMI, that is a song that is written by him. And so, I don't know, hold on. Let me make sure that you can hear it. I'll just listen to a little bit. Can you hear it? You can see it, watch the whole thing on his YouTube page, and on his blog he also has translations for the lyrics. And so, wait, can you hear me? Okay, there, making sure. All right, now, when Påle Dueñas comes to Guam, he's at the bottom of sort of the hierarchy in the Catholic Church. But what happens when World War II breaks out on Guam is that he is suddenly pushed to the top of the church, where he goes from being one priest amongst many and a young priest of that, to suddenly becoming the leader of the Catholic Church once war breaks out. And so one thing that's kind of interesting, because when we think about World War II stories, about when World War II hits Guam, we hear a lot of stories about CHamoru's hiding, about grabbing their things and heading for the ranch, heading for the jungles. We hear some stories about CHamoru's fighting in the Plaza de España against the Japanese. But for the most part, CHamoru's feel that this is not their fight, that they just need to run and get away because this is America versus Japan. Tony Palomo, in his book Island in Agony, though, gives an anecdote about Father Dueñas, which reveals sort of how something might have been awakened in him by the war. And that once Father Dueñas had heard that war had broken out on Guam, he with a bunch of young men who hung around the church, they grabbed whatever they could, rifles and guns, got a small truck and waited for the Japanese to come to INALAHAN in case they needed to fight them. Although eventually, however, they accepted that they probably couldn't defeat the Japanese or effectively fight them. So they decided to put the guns away. Now, what's interesting is that the Påle Dueñas that we find before World War II, this was not in character with how he would have responded to things, at least as far as from what we know. But once sort of, as one CHamoru put it, he was a mouse before the war and he became a lion during the war. The lion had awakened in Father Dueñas, that the war had brought violence and terror and trauma and despair to his people, and that he was going to fight to protect them. And so Father Dueñas became the head of the Catholic Church. He became sort of the acting bishop on the island, because Bishop Olano, who was the former leader of the church, he was taken as a prisoner of war. And so Påle Dueñas and Påle Scott were the only two that were left behind. And so I had wanted to make some more slides to kind of connect these points. But so the Japanese recognized that religion was key to the hearts and minds of the Chamorro people. They recognized that Chamorros were more likely to accept the Japanese if the religious leaders on the island were accepting of the Japanese. And so to this end, Father Dueñas and Påle Scott, and also Reverend Joaquin Flores de Blanc, who is the head of the Protestant church, they were given access to the Japanese command that your average Chamorro wasn't. And so they would have meetings, for example, on a regular basis, where they would meet with the Japanese commanders, administrators. They would talk about sort of the Japanese would share things, and then the religious leaders would share things. And so so we know what sometimes happened in those meetings from the perspective of Reverend Sablan and Påle Scott. We don't know exactly from the perspective of Påle Dueñas. But each of those men had a different approach to dealing with the Japanese. Reverend Joaquin Flores Sablan was the head of the American religion on Guam, and the Japanese had set out restrictions and laws to erase America from the island. They deported and sent all the Americans to prisoner of war camps. They banned the use of the English language on the island. They banned the singing of American and English songs. They banned the reading of things in English, whether a magazine or a book. And so there was worry that they were also going to ban what was the American religion on the island, which was Protestantism. And so in these meetings, Reverend Sablan was always hyper respectful, very quiet, because he did not want to draw any attention to himself. And so, for example, in one meeting, the Japanese might give talking points for propaganda. They might tell the religious leaders that they are to talk about these things in their sermons, that they are to use these points when they talk to the people so that there can be harmony and understanding rather than disagreement and mistrust. And so Reverend Sablan might take those because he didn't want any extra attention on him. At one point, he was told by the Japanese to create a list of all of round all of those people up and kill them. So he never finished the list during the war. Påle Scott was different than Father Dueñas. Both of them were dedicated to the people, but they went about it in different ways. Påle Scott believed that they should try to work with the Japanese however possible. So however possible to make things easier. And in fact, the Japanese at one point brought in 2 Catholic priests from Japan to talk to the people, to try to sort of smooth things over. And Påle Scott was known for working with and befriending at least one of those Japanese priests. And so Påle Scott might take the talking points and he might comment on them, but he may not actually incorporate them, but he would respectfully accept them. Påle Dueñas might in that meeting, and in that same meeting, when given the talking points, he might tell the Japanese that they are not to touch the religious freedoms of the people of Guam, and that they have no right to interfere with how he conducts his sermons, how the people worship, that this is a violation of their human and religious rights, and that the Japanese have no authority to touch the faith of the people, and they should leave the faith of the people alone. And so Father Dueñas found his voice, a very strong and loud voice during the war, at a time when Chamorros were afraid to speak up because if you spoke loudly and if you spoke critically against the Japanese, they would strike you down. Father Dueñas repeatedly spoke up against the Japanese, oftentimes to their faces. And that was a big contrast to just about everybody else who simply wanted to survive the war, but didn't ever want to directly challenge the Japanese because people were so powerless in comparison to them. But this is what Father Dueñas became known for during the war. Now, some would argue that his behavior was reckless. Others would argue that he was strong and that he was fierce. But however you decide to interpret it, it definitely inspired people, even if it did worry them that he was putting himself in danger. Expensive. And so when we say strong, when we say reckless, there were certain things, at least from some stories, which make you wonder. And so, for example, the song God Bless America was most definitely banned on the island during the Japanese period. And in fact, you couldn't sing or hum tunes which the Japanese knew were American or which were resistance songs. But there are many stories about many people witnessed Father Dueñas in a meeting with the Japanese in the village of INALAHAN singing or humming the tune to God Bless America in the back of the room, much to the fear, consternation of the Japanese that were in the room. People also said that he would read American magazines, that he would do it in front of the Japanese, and he would not try to hide it. So this is a quote from Jesus Baza, who's one of the founders of the Bank of Guam, in his autobiography. Father Dueñas is remembered as a good and devoted priest. People remember him as a brilliant, warm, down-to-earth young man. He was greatly admired, idolized by those who knew him and worked with him. During his short ministry, he was a dynamic preacher with a great deal of charisma. Father Dueñas was an activist. Many times people were afraid to be seen with him because he would usually yell out in a crowd and start to say something against the Japanese whenever he felt like it. Father Dueñas was like the Lone Ranger. He rode on his horse all over the island. He kept the spirit of the people up. He would come around and deliver his sermon and then take off again. And so Father Dueñas and Påle Scott divided up the island so that Påle Scott took the center and the north, and Father Dueñas took the south. At that time, travel around the south was still a little bit difficult. It took a while. There was bridges that went over all the rivers at that point. But still, it was hard, and it was difficult getting down there and getting around there. The Japanese had confiscated most of the cars. Most things of value the Japanese found their way to confiscate. So Father Dueñas did build up a sort of a mythology by biking. Sometimes he would bike around down south. Sometimes he would walk. Sometimes if he could catch a ride, people would drive him. But the most famous thing that he was known for was riding horses. So different people would lend him horses, and then he would ride around town from village to village, asking who needed help. And so he might, for example, as one young man described it to me, you could hear the galloping of the hoofbeats as he was approaching, and then as you saw him, you know, always wearing like a frock, like his priestly garb. And so he would ride in and he might yell, and this one guy said that he yelled out to him and he said, "Has somebody died in the village? Does somebody need comfort?" And then the boy pointed him in the direction towards a ranch, and Father Dueñas said, "Thank you," and then sped off on his horse to go look for the family to give them comfort. I like that. It's like the Lone Ranger for CHamoru spirituality. And so all of this led to Father Dueñas really, really being a symbol. Now, he was a different type of symbol than George Tweed. George Tweed, who we talked about last week, George Tweed was a symbol of America. He was a symbol that if you protected him, if he was safe, if you were loyal to him and what he represented, then America might return to save the Chamorro people. Father Dueñas was a Catholic Chamorro symbol. He was saying the things that Chamorros couldn't say themselves. He was doing the things that Chamorros didn't feel they could do themselves. He was standing up for them. He was being strong for them. And he was, wait, shoot, where is it? Hold on a second. I had it, okay, sorry. I thought I had it as, hold on one second. There was one story. I totally just, oh, here it is. Oh, here, sorry, they're out of order. Okay. So this is a story from INALAHAN during the war, from one of the altar boys for Father Dueñas at that time. And it refers to how there was an order that you could not light anything at night. You couldn't light a candle, you couldn't light a fire. If you did, it would be assumed that you must be signaling the Americans. And so during Mass, Father Dueñas had the lights, had the candles on, and a Japanese soldier came into the San Jose church and he started to yell at Father Dueñas. Father Dueñas did not stop the Mass, but the soldier was yelling that they needed to extinguish the lights, extinguish the candles. And so Father Dueñas continued to say the Mass, and then what's it called? Oh shoot, this is a different version of the story. But so there's different versions of the story, but ultimately Father Dueñas in one version of the story, Father Dueñas continued to say the Mass even up until the point where the Japanese soldier was holding the gun up to him at the altar, and that he did stop eventually, and then they put out the candles. But then once the soldier had left the church, he told the altar boy to light the candles again so that he could continue the Mass. So a lot of stories of interesting. You could say that they're reckless, and some Chamorros did say that Påle Dueñas was reckless, that he wasn't being smart, he wasn't being safe because he was challenging the Japanese. There was one story. There was a checkpoint outside of INALAHAN village. To get into the village, there was a koban there that you had to bow to, and you had to bow to the Japanese guards that were there. Even if the guards weren't there, you had to bow to the empty guard post. You had to show like a tag in order to pass through. And so there was one story that Father Dueñas, that when he was approaching that checkpoint, a Japanese soldier started to yell at him and shout at him, telling him to stop, and that Father Dueñas did not stop. Father Dueñas kept on going, telling the soldier in Chamorro that he was on the Lord's work, and that he was doing the Lord's work and he didn't have time to stop. The soldier came up to him, yelling at him, pointing his gun at him. According to the story, Father Dueñas went up and slapped the soldier and stunned him, and then just kept walking through and on into the village. And so a lot of people whispered that God was watching over Father Dueñas, that God must be protecting him. And some families even shared what they called that were miracles. So one family in INALAHAN, for example, they were their farm wasn't producing enough food for them. The Japanese were taking food. They were worried they were going to starve. And so when Father Dueñas came and visited them, he said, "Let us pray. Let us pray in your fields." So he took them out of the house, and they went to the gardens outside the house and the fields nearby the house, and they said prayers in them. and that the family swore that the plants, the crops grew faster than ever after that, and they had enough to eat, and they were able to helping them. Now, a lot of this put Father Dueñas at odds with the Japanese, as you can imagine. The Japanese discussed deporting Father Dueñas to Roda as punishment for speaking out against them. Different Japanese officers threatened directly Father Dueñas, chastising him for his lack of respect and threatening to hurt him, to execute him, to beat him. But for most of the war, nothing happened. Because he was the leader of the Catholic Church, he was given a wide berth in order to act in hopes of eventually getting the Chamorro people to accept the Japanese. Even when the Japanese Catholic priests that were brought to Guam tried to work with Father Dueñas told them that he thought they were spies from the Japanese and that he did not want to work with them. And so eventually, at least according to publicly, what became the pretense for the Japanese arresting Father Dueñas and punishing him was George Tweed. Was that in the closing days of the war, more people were hurt, more people were arrested and brutalized, and some executed on the pretense of helping George Tweed. Father Dueñas had helped George Tweed early in the war. He had been part of the resistance network, which hid radio parts, which fed U.S. soldiers and helped keep them hidden. He had participated in those sorts of things. But he hadn't seen George Tweed by that point in July of 1944 in a very long time. And so Father Dueñas was arrested in the village of Inalahan. And he was beaten in the middle of the village, in front of the eyes of the people of the village, along with his nephew, who was an attorney, Edward Dueñas. And they were beaten and they were tortured. And one thing, though, that the people of the village said about Father Dueñas was timanatekon sipali, that they never made Father Dueñas bow his head, meaning that Father Dueñas never submitted to the torture, that he never spoke, he never gave up names, he never gave up Tweed, that he remained strong even as they brutalized him. They beat him, they hit him with wooden boards on his back and on his front. Some people said that they took like nails and needles and dug them into his flesh. Some said that they put ants, they encouraged ants to crawl on him, red ants to bite him, to irritate him while he was tied up. And they did a type of torture which the Japanese seemed to enjoy greatly, which was known as the water torture or the water treatment, in which they take a hose and they fill you up with water. And then once you're feeling very bloated and full of water, then they punch you in the stomach or they hit you in the stomach with a wooden board. The abuse that he received, Father Dueñas remained lucid, but it took a terrible toll on his nephew. After this torture, they were taken to Ta'i, which is in the village of Mingilao, which is close to where the school is today that has the name Father Dueñas. And there, as American bombs were falling around the island and Americans were preparing to reinvade the island, Father Dueñas was executed, along with his nephew, another man that we still aren't sure who he was, although there's some guesses, and then finally Juan Mali Pangilinan, who was the second to the last person to hide George Tweed. In order to kind of understand the strength of Father Dueñas, and what he meant, and the example that he gives as a historical figure, as a Chamorro, as a Catholic, if you want. We only need to remember the last conversations that he had with people, because as the island was starting to be destroyed in preparation of the American reinvasion and the Japanese were moving into defensive posture to prepare, there were several chances for Father Dueñas to try to escape. And different people tried to encourage him to escape from the Japanese headquarters in Tai. And so, according to different people, he gave different reasons as to why he could not escape, why he should not escape. One reason was that if he was to save his own life, what is to keep the Japanese from going to the village of INALAHAN and hurting the people of INALAHAN instead? What is to keep them from going and executing everybody with the last name Dueñas? Because he chose to save himself. And so better that he suffer rather than the Japanese go and make everybody suffer. Second is that he said that he did not want to leave his nephew. That his nephew had already been beaten so badly. His nephew was clinging on to life, and that he said that he had lived his life according to God's plan, and that if it was God's plan that he be here, and God's plan that he die here, who is he to question God's plan? It is a sharp contrast with that of Tweed, where many suffered for one, but Tweed chose, for selfish reasons or for larger reasons as a symbol of America, to protect himself and to save himself. And so after the war, after the American reinvasion, Father Dueñas, through the help of interpreters from the Northern Islands, the people of INALAHAN and Polly Scott, who's here, this is an image from when they found Father Dueñas' body. And he was executed and buried in what is jungle now, across the street from where Father Dueñas is, the school is. And so they dug up the body, they found a number of his personal items with it, and then they took the body and they brought it back down to INALAHAN, where he was buried under the altar of Gumadu San Jose, of St. Joseph's Church in INALAHAN. And so in order to honor Father Dueñas, and in order to honor sort of what he lived for, the church decided to name a school, a boys' high school, after him. And it is still there up until this day. And it was something which sort of the more elite families on the island sent their children to for a very long time. Lots of governors, elite politicians, captains of industry, right after the war, were schooled at Father Dueñas. And so the legacy of Father Dueñas, though, is very interesting, because if you look in the history books, because the people of INALAHAN had basically adopted and accepted him because of what he suffered in their village, how he sacrificed for their village, and so that's why he was buried there. And so I don't know if any of you are Father Dueñas grads, but so one of the things that's interesting about his legacy that comes after is, if you look in the history books, so news coverage of Father Dueñas after the war highlighted the fact that he had died, quote unquote, for his Americanism. So news articles that went out across the United States talked about Father Dueñas in the context of how he had died for George Tweed, that he had died for sort of supporting America again over the Japanese, loving America over the Japanese, and so on. And so in 1970, for example, Carlos Camacho, who was the governor at that time, he declared Father Dueñas Day, sort of on the anniversary, I guess this would have been the 26th anniversary of his death. And so in the proclamation for Father Dueñas Day, now it's not a real holiday, it's one of those days of commemoration. So he highlighted that he was a man of God, and and a man of fierce pride and patriotism for the country he loved so much, and that he at times defied the enemy's efforts to hamper his ministry and to force from him through physical torture. All right, whereas Father Dueñas chose death rather than bow to the enemy's wishes, thus becoming a great symbol of loyalty and love to the United States and of hope for deliverance from bondage. Whereas in the view of the heroic exploits of Father Dueñas, it is only right and appropriate that the people of Guam pay homage and respect to this young patriot priest who was killed because of his love for God and our country. And so many history books bring out that element to Father Dueñas. And it's interesting because then in Father Dueñas, the school of Father Dueñas, there becomes a strong emphasis on joining the US military. So the Father Dueñas grads have a pipeline to go to military academies in the United States. But one of the things that's interesting though, is that for people who were there at that time, in World War II, even though there are many stories about Father Dueñas sort of challenging the Japanese by reading American things, singing American songs, and so on, from the people who were there, there's not a strong emphasis that Father Dueñas was promoting the United States or that he was encouraging patriotism in the United States. So for example, this is from an interview with his nephew, Judge Cristobal Dueñas. He had a strong faith. During the war, he stood for the rights of the people. What are those rights? This Pacific Voice, which is the Catholic newspaper in Guam. Rights to be treated as human beings. We are people who have dignity and freedom. He took it upon himself, not only because he has the responsibility towards the people, not only because he was their leader, but because he belonged to them. He was one of them. He loved his people and he pursued his responsibility to the utmost of his ability. And this is from Ben Meno, who was a master of Canton Samarita from the village of Inalahan. He says, war was so hard. God to send the Americans, but when the American came, the Chamorro people forget that it was God who sent the Americans. It was God who kept the Chamorro people alive. And so an interesting thing happens with Father Dueñas' story, but with the experiences of Chamorros in general, is that we talked about it last class in terms of what happens with Liberation Day. Is that Liberation Day in its first instance is a solemn religious occasion in which there's no like celebrations, there's no military. It's about Santamir Kamelin, it's about the faith, and it's about remembering those who have died. And for Chamorros at that time, that is what you would call, quote unquote, an authentic expression from their culture, from their peoplehood. And so Father Dueñas' position is the same as well, in that he had people encouraged to have faith in America, but always that God was higher than America. That sort of you didn't give your devotion to America, but to God, and that God would watch over. But what happens soon after, though, is that Father Dueñas and sort of Chamorro identity in general gets wrapped up and jumbled around, and sort of this patriotism becomes the dominant thing instead. And the Chamorro is kind of lost in that equation. The Chamorro loses some of its power, some of its consistency once that happens. And one of the very sad things about this, now I am not Catholic. To me, if Father Dueñas becomes a saint or not, I mean, it would be interesting. I definitely think that Father Dueñas deserves more recognition. But one of the problems and sad things about all this is that the more that history books and the more that the church and the more that anyone says that Father Dueñas was a patriot, that he died for America, the less chance there is that he could become a saint, that he could be recognized religiously. Because part of the issue with martyrdom, right, is that if somebody kills you, it can't be because they hate you personally. It can't be because they hate your government. It can't be because they hate your ideology. It has to be because they hate God, and that you die for the religion that you believed in, not that you died for a country that you believed in. And so that was one thing that those who were pushing for the beatification of Father Dueñas, that they discovered, is that actually a lot of the attention that had been given to his legacy to turn him into an American patriot worked against their argument that he should be honored within the church. Because if he did die for the United States, it means the Japanese didn't kill him because of his faith. They killed him because of his politics. And so you would be hard to argue to a tribunal that Father Dueñas is the epitome of somebody who has died and been martyred, and an example, a paragon for others in the church, when so much about him and the way we remember him gives him secular motivation, ideological and political motivation. But for me, what's unfortunate is that Father Dueñas is somebody who represents a lot of strength for the Chamorro people. That his story is one that we should absolutely continue to tell. But as with so many of our sort of figures and our leaders, they get lost in the shuffle. And so I am not Catholic, but I have always been confused at the Catholic Church. Always been confused as to why the Catholic Church doesn't do more to promote the local heroes within its church. Why is it that they simply kind of seem to flow with the trends of the church globally and not seem to try to root the faith in the heroes, in its heroes locally? And I always wonder about that, because one thing that people talk about is that there's a stronger than ever disconnect between the Chamorro culture and the Catholic Church on Guam. That sort of Chamorros are actually leaving the Catholic Church in big numbers. And what's fascinating is that prior to World War II, and we talked about this when we talked about Pale Palomo, is that the church was able to keep Chamorros close to the religion because they started to do everything in Chamorro, and they started to promote the culture of the Chamorro people. And it kept Chamorros from going to any new religions or leaving the church, because now Chamorros were like, oh, you know, I get my kids get in trouble for speaking English in school, but here we get to speak Chamorro, we get to love the language and embrace it. And that, you know, over there I feel displaced and I feel alienated from the power structure because I'm not white enough, I'm not American enough. Oh, but the church embraces who I am. This is nice. But what we've seen since World War II is that we've seen that the church has kind of not built upon that, has not built upon its local heroes. Your average person doesn't really know much about Father Dueñas. And your average person doesn't even know who Padre Palomo is. And even people who frequently go to his park, I think that Påle Dueñas' story is exciting, it's exceptional, it's beautiful, it's tragic. There are certain things that are complicated about it. For example, some of the things that I've told you today, there's disputes about them. And one of the reasons that sometimes happens in a community as small as sort of the Chamorro community of Guam is that if things are complicated, if things get a little bit too tricky, then the story doesn't go on, then the story doesn't get passed on, because there's too many things to deal with it, right? That it's almost easier to tell somebody else's story because you don't have to deal with the drama of that story, right? So I don't think we're going to talk about, I was thinking, instead of Påle Dueñas, I was thinking about Jose Tonko Reyes, who organized the uprising at Apathy when the Chamorros in Maleso killed the Japanese that were holding them prisoner. I thought about him today instead of Påle Dueñas. But both of them have similar issues where the local drama and the local intimate connections to it, that they can end up making people don't tell the story because there's some messiness there. So with Tonko Reyes, for example, part of it was that some men who may not have fought and killed the Japanese tried to argue that they had fought and killed the Japanese. And some men who were there and fought and killed the Japanese tried to argue that they had led the fight, that they had organized it. And so when something gets messy like that, there's competing narratives. It's hard to elevate it to a status of a story that we should all know when people compete in that, when it's contested in that way. For Father Dueñas, one of the main things that led, so he, within the village of Inarahan, his story remains fairly strong. For much of the island, it's not as strong, but within the village of Inarahan, it remains very strong. Part of it is because the leaders in the village have worked hard to keep telling his story. And some people, such as Ben Menno, who I mentioned here, and Bill Paulino, who used to be the head of Chamorro Language Commission. Those are two men born after World War II, but who heard the stories of Father Dueñas and keep them alive and keep telling them and keep finding ways to keep the story going. But one thing that made it complicated was that, and this is something that's always on the edge of war stories, including many of your own family's war stories, and that these are the things that are most difficult to talk about. And it's when Chamorros, we may think that some stories about when the Chamorros were brutalized by the Japanese, that those are hard to tell. But the most difficult ones to tell are the ones when Chamorros brutalized Chamorros. Chamorros were not fight in World War II, but when Chamorros turned against each other in World War II. And so within the village of Inarahan, many people argue that the reason why Father Dueñas was caught, was arrested and tortured and eventually executed by the Japanese wasn't really about Tweed. But one of the things, and we know this from Father Dueñas' diary, because we have fragments of his diary that he kept during the war, is that he was angry most of all at the Chamorros who were collaborating with the Japanese. That he was very angry. He was angry at the Japanese. He had a lot of contempt for the Chamorros who were working with the Japanese to help oppress their own people. And one of the things which was unfortunately common at that time was that if a Japanese officer might be interested in a Chamorro young woman, the family might hide her away. They might dress her up to make her look ugly. They might cut her hair. One thing that some women did in their families is that they would smear taki. They would smear crap on themselves to make themselves smell bad, that they would hold it in their pockets to try to keep Japanese soldiers from assaulting them. But what some families did is that if there was an officer or a soldier who was interested, they would encourage their daughters to go out with them. They would encourage their daughters to be the girlfriend of this officer. And in exchange, they might get protection, they might get food. And so at that time, there really wasn't any ability to appeal the sort of the treatment of the Japanese. But Father Dueñas was aware of the conventions, that a lot of what the Japanese was doing was against the conventions that countries had agreed to before the war about how you treat occupied populations. So he did quote that to the Japanese, that they are not to use the church or the religions of the people they occupy for propaganda, that they cannot use the pulpit of the church for propaganda. And that's why Dueñas told the Japanese to their face, you cannot do that. But so what happened in Hagåtña, it was a Chamorro family. It was a white father and then a Chamorro mother, and that they had at least one daughter who was very beautiful, and that she was the girlfriend for one of the officers in command of the village. And that the family had gotten close to the Japanese, even to the point where the daughter would have her boyfriend take things from other Chamorro families and like victimize other Chamorro families. And no one talked about it because you didn't want to upset anybody. You didn't want to get in trouble. but Father Dueñas spoke openly about it and condemned the family for what they were doing to their faces. And he, from his pulpit, told the Chamorro people in his village that they are not to collaborate with the Japanese, that they are not to work with them against their own people. And so the people in the village many people in the village feel strongly that Father Dueñas was arrested and targeted to get back at him for what he had done for what he had been saying about that Chamorro family and then the leaders in the village. And so when stories have elements like that, a lot of times they don't get passed on because they're messy. It's better to praise somebody from the outside because it seems simpler and easier than to talk about the messiness that exists, right? The messiness that exists within your own family. It's a historiographical way of like the grass is greener on the other side. Other people's heroes are easier because they're not ours. It's easier to praise America because it seems big and it seems like this from afar. But when we're talking about praising ourselves, we know ourselves and we know that we may be good most of the time, but we also have flaws as well. And so, but I still think that Father Dueñas his story should be told more. But one thing that we see though that comes out of World War II is the stories that Chamorros share which align with the new American patriotism. Those are the stories that get told. Those are the stories that get told. Those are the stories that get passed on. The ones which don't quite fit, don't quite line up, they don't get told as much. And so, for example, even when thinking about massacres, right? When thinking about massacres, on Guam in the closing days of the war, there was a number of massacres around the island. Which do you think, which are you familiar with? Which is the worst of all of those massacres? Anyone? There was quite a few. And we now have markers for many of them around the island. Oh, good, Fenna. That you did take my previous Chamorro history class, didn't you? So Fenna is the worst, but it's not the one that is documented the most or talked about the most. Instead, the ones which are talked about the most are Tinta and Faja in the village of Malesu. And those are brutal, horrible massacres, for sure. But one reason why Tinta and Faja, compared to other massacres that happen around the island, are elevated is because one of those massacres took place because the Chamorros were too patriotic to the United States. So that one massacre occurred because the Japanese wanted to eliminate the strongest in the village, the ones who could fight back. The other one happened because these were Chamorros who were too close to America or who had disrespected the Japanese and who had stayed too loyal to America and had not given up their loyalty to America. So, for example, Maria Lucban Mesa, who was a Filipino woman who had married a Chamorro, who was the first Chamorro dentist, Tomas Mesa, she is one of those where she famously refused to bow to the Japanese, and she refused to respect the Japanese, and that she openly, hoped for America's return. And that she was involved in one of those massacres where the Japanese wanted to get back at those who were too American. Whereas Fenna is much more brutal, much more horrible, and it's really just tied to the Japanese taking out their anger on the Chamorro people and horrifically brutalizing them. But so that's one of the things that happens with our history, is that once World War II comes around and sort of there's this new emphasis on Chamorro patriotism, it even affects how we see the past, where the stories that affirm and align with this new patriotism, they get brought out. and they get retold over and over and over again. Whereas the ones that are a little bit more complicated, but maybe don't make America look so good. That's one reason why the uprising at Apathy, when the Chamorro men fight off the Japanese, kill them themselves, told. It's because it doesn't prop up the United States. These were men who were worried that their families were going to get massacred by the Japanese because they had finally received word that the secret work or the special work details that 60 people had been taken on, that these were actually executions. And so these men decided in the middle of the day to try to kill the Japanese that were holding them prisoner to save their families. But they did this before the US reinvaded the island. And because it doesn't fit in with America saving the Chamorro people, or Chamorros being sort of being loyal to the United States, it doesn't get told. And so even in the village, there are memorials marking where those who were massacred. There are memorials for those marking where those who were massacred. But there's still no commemoration for the men who fought and killed the Japanese and saved their families. And so, you know, this is why I love teaching history, and I love talking about these stories, because there's so many good stories that don't rise to the top. And it's important for us to look past that filter and see what's back there, because you'll find some amazing stories. And we shouldn't judge our stories, we shouldn't judge our heroes based on how closely aligned they were with the United States. We shouldn't do that, especially when we're looking at the past. Which one? No. So, which one? At the memorial, or the names listed of those at I do have a list of everyone that I could find who was there at Apathy. I think oh wait, no, we didn't include it. We didn't include it in the book Massacre at Apathy, though, because it was a sensitive issue. Because there were some families that said that their father was there. There's some families that said that this person wasn't there. And so, you think that part of this is fueled by? Oh, I definitely think so. I definitely think so. But I think that's why your father may have been involved. Ignacio Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
Let me
because he was very close friend of Mr. Torres.
I wonder, was he in Malesso?
Yes, he's from Malesso.
Was he in Malesso, or was he somewhere else? I'll have to check.
Malesso.
He may have. I have a list. I have a list somewhere of all of the ones that we were able to find who were probably there. I'll have to look it up though. And so, yes, a lot of it has to do with that desire for recognition, wanting to prove that they were loyal, because loyalty to America is something that gets Chamorro's benefits after the war. Prove that you're loyal, you prove to suffer for them, and then you can get access to new programs, right? And so that was definitely part of it. But we can see that what happens then is that the stories that are told versus the stories that are not told, then the next generation thinks that the stories that are told must be all the stories, or they must be the best stories, because these are the ones that are being told. And so, yeah, I always feel bad with Father Dueñas, I always feel bad because George Tweed always takes up so much attention in the World War II story, when he does almost nothing during the war except hide. But his presence takes up so much.
Every year when you have the ceremony, Do they list the names there in the program? You have to have a program,
No.
right? Every year. No? Oh.
They oftentimes don't do that. Now they have done that sometimes, but so they always list those that died in the Tinta and Faja massacre and those that survived. Now for some years, and it depends on who's organizing it, they have then listed the men who liberated the village, but sometimes they'll go off of this one picture, which was published in the Guam Daily News in 1955, 10 years after, and it recounted the story of what they called the mighty men of Maritzo. And so a lot of people assume that the only men who were there are the 6 in the picture, when in truth, the one on the right of the picture, Sus Barcinas, was not even there. And in fact, he was very upset when he found out that the others had killed the Japanese, because he was naturally worried that the Japanese were going to come back and kill everybody. But that's one of those sad things, is that they deserve that recognition. I think that every year when they honor those that died, they should honor those that fought back. I think that it's definitely something for our, now things are a little bit different nowadays. We're more comfortable and open celebrating ourselves, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Still a lot of work to be done. And so I definitely think that for Charles at that time, there was the thinking that you could only gain recognition within the United States. And as I talked about last class in the context of Liberation Day, Chamorros felt that their experiences didn't have value. Like, right? So for example, that's why, but that's a change. That's a change in values, right? And perspective, because some of parents may have felt that their war story didn't matter, because at that time, when they were in the war, when after the war, who wanted to hear what a Chamorro went through? Who cared what a Chamorro went through? But now our people's perspective and the world's perspective has shifted. So now the experience of your average person in a traumatic time, it has value. It gives us some of the history. It tells an important part of the story. And so we know that now. But for a lot of the people at that time, there was the thinking that what I went through can't be important because I'm not an admiral or a general or a commander or a president. I'm just a farmer. That's all I am. You know, what do I can't tell you anything important. But so it also comes down to that too. That's why, you know, when Chamorros were trying to figure out how to celebrate themselves, it eventually became an American celebration for a generation or two, because they just didn't have the symbols to celebrate themselves at that time. Now we've got the symbols. So now when you want to think, what's Chamorro? You put a sinahi on somebody. You put a laddie stone. You put a canoe. Maybe you put somebody on a carabao. These are Chamorro symbols that we can be proud of. But at that time, you know, if you were trying to, if, you know, Chamorros didn't feel that those were powerful symbols or important symbols. They didn't have the feeling of connection to the Lati that we have today. You know, they didn't feel that the canoe was there the way we want to reconnect to it today. But that's the importance of learning this history and learning these stories. And so I hope that the Father Dueñas story is taken up by the church. The church has so much more documentation on Father Dueñas than I've ever seen. And I haven't ever been able to see a lot of what they have, including the late Polly Scott. His family had a big collection of a lot of stuff, which also had more information on this. But just thinking about, when we think about the types of models that we want to put out to our people, to the island, a model of somebody like Father Dueñas is important, because somebody who answers the call of the moment. So I told you before, Chispas. People would call him Chispas because, and he moved quickly and sort of in an anxious way when he walked. But then during the war, they call him Chispas because he's full of fire, because he's everywhere, because you turn your head and Påle Dueñas is in another village helping the people's spirits, and that he couldn't be stopped. And so even just that name itself achieves something new after that. But so, yeah, we should learn our history as well, so that we can take what a book gives us, which may be sterile, neutral, and abstract, and we can fill it with that life as well. But yeah, we want to inspire people to stand up, to speak out, to believe in something larger than themselves, and especially believe in their island and their people as being larger than themselves too. All right. Todus Mase. Todus Mase. We had a small crowd today. All right. So next week we're going to 7. We're going to number 7 next week. We just have 7, 8, 9, 10. We got 4 more. 4 more, and then we are done. Are there any last quick questions before we say adios? Again, Ahi? Nope. Okay. All right. Todus Mase. Adios. Esta semana lihe talo. Adios esta otra semana.
Thank you for the t-shirts. We got them in the mail.
Oh, hey, Biba.
So they're very nice. Thank you.
Hamyo.
Good.